Chapter 1.7.6, Organizing Cluster Access Using kubeconfig Files. Kubeconfig files are used to organize information about clusters, users, namespaces, and authentication mechanisms. The kubectl command line tool relies on these files to select a cluster and interact with the API server. It is important to note that a configuration file used for access to clusters is called a kubeconfig file. Users should only use kubeconfig files from trusted sources to avoid potential security risks. If necessary, carefully inspect untrusted kubeconfig files before use. By default, kubectl looks for a file named config in the home/kube directory, but can also specify other kubeconfig files using the kubeconfig environment variable or the -kubeconfig flag. For detailed instructions on creating and utilizing kubeconfig files, refer to the guide Configure Access to Multiple Clusters. Supporting multiple clusters, users, and authentication mechanisms. In managing multiple clusters with various authentication methods, kubeconfig files are essential for organizing clusters, users, and namespaces. This allows for the authentication of components using certificates, users using tokens, and administrators providing sets of certificates to individual users. Contexts can be defined within kubeconfig files to facilitate quick switching between clusters and namespaces, streamlining the overall management process. A kubeconfig file uses context elements to group access parameters under a convenient name, including cluster, namespace, and user. The kubectl command line tool communicates with the cluster using parameters from the current context by default. To choose the current context, users can specify it within the kubeconfig file. The kubeconfig environment variable. The kubeconfig environment variable is used to hold a list of kubeconfig files, with the format of the list being different for Linux, Mac, :delimited, and Windows, :delimited. This variable is not mandatory, as if it is not present, kubectl will default to using the kubeconfig file located at choms to a kubeconfig. However, if the kubeconfig variable is defined, kubectl will merge the files listed in it to create an effective configuration for use. Merging kubeconfig files. When using the kubectl command to view configuration, the output can come from a single kubeconfig file or the merging of several kubeconfig files. The rules for merging kubeconfig files are as follows. If the @kubeconfig flag is set, only the specified file is used without merging. If the kubeconfig environment variable is set, it is used as a list of files to be merged. Empty file names are ignored, and errors are produced for files with content that cannot be deserialized. The first file to set a specific value or map key wins, and subsequent conflicting entries are discarded. If the kubeconfig environment variable is not set, the default kubeconfig file, home kubeconfig, is used without merging. The context to use is determined based on the context flag or the current context from the merged kubeconfig files. The cluster and user information is determined based on the first hit in the chain of command line flags, context, and merged kubeconfig files. The actual cluster and user information to use is determined based on a hierarchy of command line flags, context, and merged files. Only one authentication technique per user is allowed, and default values are used for any missing information. In some cases, authentication information may need to be prompted for. File references. The text explains that file and path references in a kubeconfig file are relative to its location, while file references on the command line are relative to the current working directory. Kubeconfig file. Relative paths are stored relative to the kubeconfig file, and absolute paths are stored as they are. To set up a proxy for a specific cluster in kubectl, add the proxy URL configuration in the kubeconfig file for that cluster.